Okay, so I'm really thrilled to welcome to ODSECS tonight Robbie Richardson, who is an assistant professor of English at Princeton University. Before he took up this brand new post at the beginning of this academic year, he was a senior lecturer in 18th century studies at the University of Kent. Robbie's the author of The Savage and Modern Self, North American Indians in 18th Century Literature and Culture, which was published by Toronto Press, University of Toronto Press in 2018. It's a really amazing monograph that explores the ways in which 18th century writers and collectors depict Indigenous North American people and objects and cultures, and use those depictions to navigate emerging ideas about colonialism and consumerism and modernity and selfhood. I have had the privilege of some wonderful conversations with colleagues about Robbie over the past week, and I wanted to share some of the things that I've heard about him, not to embarrass him, but rather to convey something of the impact that Robbie has on our global academic community. One of our colleagues mentioned that what they find so compelling about Robbie's work is the way it conjures the places and contexts and presence of Indigenous material culture in 18th century manuscripts, museum collections and engravings. And this person said that Robbie really reanimates the objects that have not survived in archives and museum collections, as well as some that have, and that helps us to understand those objects both on their own terms and on ours. Some of Robbie's former colleagues at the University of Kent told me a little bit about his teaching. They celebrated the way in which Robbie brings the kind of innovative cross-disciplinary research methods that we see in his published work into the classroom. And Robbie's students often commented that his teaching made them think and rethink their own understanding of texts. Several of our colleagues commented on just how much they love being around Robbie. One of them recalled being on a train with him from Canterbury to London, and said that there's something telling about having an intense conversation with him in a place where people are on the move, out in the world, meeting before parting, just like Robbie always is, with his eyes seeing the present and the past in all things. And another colleague said to me that the way knowledge pours out of Robbie in an unceasing, joyful stream is a wonder to behold. I'm so delighted and thrilled that Robbie is with us virtually this evening, but feels nonetheless very present with us. And he's going to be speaking to us about sacred medicine at Strawberry Hill, British antiquaries and Indigenous objects. So Robbie, over to you.
Wow, well, thank you for that introduction. I sort of at a loss for words, which is a bad time for that to happen, but fortunately my words are written down for me. Sorry, I'll just share this here. Okay. Sorry, I'm just getting used to the juggling act here. Okay, so I will begin. In this paper, I want to consider the engagement of 18th century British antiquaries with North American Indigenous people, and provisionally at how they understood the influx of Indigenous material culture to Britain in light of their antiquarian pursuits. While antiquaries were considered eccentrics dedicated to European history in all its minutiae, even by the standards of their own time, and were frequent targets of satire for their singular and often pedantic devotion to the past, a full 1/3 of the objects donated to the Society of Antiquaries in the final third of the 18th century were in fact ethnographic or exotic objects, originating from non-European cultures and places. Many of these, of course, came from Cook's 3 Pacific voyages, whose thousands of artifacts were in many ways foundational to the rise of the museum as imperial repository, to comparative ethnography, and to art history as we know it. But a large assortment also came from various North American indigenous nations. In my book, I look at representations of Indians in 18th century British literature, visual culture, and of their material culture in museum collections and coffeehouse displays as a way of negotiating modernity as a kind of blank slate to bounce off notions of cultural change in the period. But here I'm attempting in part to look at the Indian as a figure that opens up the past and prehistory in a way that complicates stadialist theories and primitivism. The antiquarian devotion to objects and their desire to let them speak or give evidence for themselves, as Crystal Lake discusses in her recent book, Artifacts, influences our own historical methodologies and approaches to material culture today. Did antiquaries let indigenous objects speak in the same way as the artifacts they found in ancient barrows and fields across Britain? How did they relate to those objects? And what stories did they tell? And if Western antiquarianism is premised on a fundamental break between past and present, between ancients and moderns, what does it mean to study a culture as if they were their own living ancestors? I'd like to begin this paper geographically, in the least likely place from whence to discuss North American indigenous material culture, in the bottom of a glacial lake in the north of England in the 1690s. Martin Mere, mere is the Saxon word for lake or sea, or just, I think, generally big body of water. Martin Mere in Lancashire was the largest body of fresh water in England from the end of the Ice Age until 1692. When wealthy and industrious landowner Thomas Fleetwood obtained a grant for the land around the mere and attempted to drain it. In this endeavor, he was ultimately unsuccessful, and Fleetwood did not live to see the rich soils of the drained mere utilized in the mid-19th century, or indeed its current iteration as a protected wetland for birds. He did, however, reveal a wealth of other things that were in the lake, and physician, antiquarian, and Royal Society fellow Charles Lee keenly documented some of these curiosities in his volume, The Natural History of Lancashire, Cheshire, and the Peak in Derbyshire, published at Oxford in 1700. Among the teeming numbers of displaced fish, Lee writes, as roach, eels, pikes, perch, breams, and the like, were found no less than 8 canoes. And here, in this plate from the book, Lee writes, Lee explains that figure 1 at the top is an Indian canoe found upon the draining of Martin Mere in Lancashire. Below this canoe are 2 objects which were found nearby it. The former is a stone like that of a whetstone, the other a copper instrument, not much unlike the head of an axe. Robert Plott, the first keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, had discovered similar items in Staffordshire a decade or so earlier, and attributed them to the Romans, carelessly dropped by errant soldiers and treacherous mountain passes in the Peak District millennia ago. But Lee insists, quote, I cannot but conclude that he was certainly mistaken, and do rather look upon these to be Indian instruments, since the Indians at this day make use of such of an axe in forming their canoes and barking their trees, which at this day they call a tomahawk. Here is a similar canoe found in the 19th century, also in Martin Mere, now dated to the 6th century, alongside the account of native Virginians making their boats, to which Lee was referring. But of course, as you can see, they were doing this with fire, not axe. I suppose the first question to ask is, how did these objects, apparently made by the indigenous people of North America, find themselves at the bottom of a glacial lake in northwest England? But perhaps more importantly, how did this vocabulary, the Arawak canoe and the Algonquian tomahawk, find its way into British prehistory? And how did it shape a past which was only then beginning to emerge from the primeval shadows? For British antiquaries, the material culture of indigenous peoples could illuminate an often inscrutable past. It's worth pointing out, of course, that Lee was not the first to draw connections between the ancient and unknown people of Britain and the so-called Indians of North America. Thomas Harriot's A Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia from 1588, the first British account of the New World, by someone who actually went there, famously includes engravings of Indians alongside illustrations of Picts to show, quote, the inhabitants of the Great Brittany have been in times past as savage as those of Virginia. Indeed, this strain of thought of Indians as Britons became paradigmatic for British colonial discourse in the early 17th century. A reminder, as Alden Vaughan suggests, that, quote, those barbarous heathen primitives might have remained in idolatry and ignorance had not Roman soldiers introduced them to Christianity and European civility. As Samuel Purkis would write in 1613, were we ourselves not made and not born civil in our progenitors' days? Were we ourselves made and not born civil in our progenitors' days? And were not Caesar's Britons as brutish as Virginians? Elsewhere, he more grimly and tellingly writes that, quote, Roman swords were the best teachers of civility. Another anonymous 17th century writer, in discussing the complex relationships between Britain's own internal territories, declared, we have Indians at home, Indians in Cornwall, Indians in Wales, Indians in Ireland. Yet this widespread insistence on both an inherent similarity and a potential need for violent subjugation would effectively disappear by the 1620s across most missionary and colonialist propaganda due to the actual failure to make Indians into subjects of gentle civility by force or otherwise. Among antiquaries, however, the insistence on similarities remained. In Samuel Daniel's first part of the History of England from 1612, he notes that Britain was once, quote, a multitude of petty regiments, as the West world lately discovered. John Woodward, an antiquarian frequent target of satire, who appears as Dr. Fossil in John Gay's 3 Hours After Marriage, noted that ancient Britons were barbarous and wholly uncivilized, and, quote, painted their bodies with the figures of various animals after the manner of their savage nations. And Thomas Pownall, who I will return to later, denied the etymology of Pictish as meaning painted, since Indians and South Seas people had tattoos, meaning therefore all primitive people had tattoos, and thus Caesar would not have found it unusual when he encountered Picts while colonizing Britain. I should add, somewhat speculatively, that the antiquarian tendency to look to native cultures as providing evidence of the past is primarily rooted in Northern European thinkers beginning in the 15th century, where the search for barbarian origins rather than Greco-Roman origins meant trying to find the past in monuments not described by the ancients. As Alain Schnapp argues, the way to combat, quote, the wear of memory, the corruption of traditions, the erosion of monuments, is to find traces of history in the present, and therefore many looked to the Americas for this uncorrupted tradition. The absence of large monuments in most of North America made the culture seem even more eternal and ahistorical, with no sign of ruination. But of course, Europeans did not understand that for most indigenous cultures, as Susan Stewart lately points out in the Ruins lesson, what is monumental and treasured is in fact bound to the land itself. But as indigenous material culture began to be more widely collected in Britain towards the end of the 17th century, at the same time that British antiquaries were being found in plowed fields and drained lakes, the knowledge contained in both, as at Martin Mere, could intersect. For example, for early collectors of natural history across Britain, one of the more curious items found with relative frequency was what was known as coronia, known mainly across Britain as thunderbolts, though in Scotland, similar items were also known as elf's arrows. These were long assumed to be natural phenomena, so called because, as Bishop Littleton noted in the 1760s, they fall from the clouds in storms of thunder. Others suggested they acquired their unique shape when lightning struck the ground and possessed magical properties. Edward Fluid, pardon my Welsh, keeper of the Ashmolean after Robert Plot, explains the Scottish opinion in regards to the arrows that, quote, the fairies, having not much power themselves to hurt animal bodies, do sometimes carry away men in the air, and furnishing them with bows and arrows, employ them to shoot men, cattle, etc. In the 16th century, keeper of the Vatican's collection, Michel Mercati, noted the resemblance between implements acquired from Mexico and the thunderbolts of Europe in his possession. And he speculated that these curious stone shapes prized in Renaissance cabinets had been made by prehistoric people. But this text was lost to antiquaries until the 18th century, and in Britain it remained commonplace to still ascribe their origins to storms and to invisible beings. Indeed, the belief in elf arrows is recorded in parts of England and Scotland into the 20th century. Part of the scandal in attributing these found items to early Britain rather than to natural or supernatural forces was that the Bible ascribed an early origin to metallurgy. Why, therefore, would these primitive people use implements of stone and flint when metal was available? For some antiquaries, the solution was that following the chaos of the biblical deluge, certain cultures degenerated, and this could explain both the roughly hewn tools of early Britons and the supposedly crude materials of the Indians. In either case, both Plot and Fluid were able to note resemblances between the North American materials and the Ashmolean and these mysterious objects. As Fluid writes in 1699, these items ascribed to elves or fairies, quote, are just the same chipped flints the natives of New England head their arrows with at this day. And there are also several stone hatchets found in this kingdom, not unlike those of the Americans. In 1715, Leeds antiquary Ralph Thoresby could boast among the objects in his collection and museum an Indian arrow from West Indies with a flint head of an orange color in the form of those so-called elves' arrows in Scotland. He adds that the elves' arrows are worn as amulets, but only by the credulous. They are clearly arrows, since, quote, the Indians do to this day head their arrows with such like as appears by the one in the museum. By 1765, when Bishop Littleton presented some European thunderbolts to the Society of Antiquaries in London, he could confidently proclaim that, quote, there is not the least doubt of these stone instruments having been fabricated in the earliest times and by barbarous people, before the use of iron or other metals was known. To confirm this knowledge, which could only be denied by the vulgar or the absurd, he cites the early material from Mexico in Mediterranean collections, as well as the Indian objects in the Ashmolean. The rise in stadial theory, of course, helped reinforce this understanding of the resemblance between primitive tools. As Rosemary Sweet notes, the recognition that human society assumed comparable characteristics in its various stages of development, irrespective of its ultimate racial origins, represented a significant conceptual advance for antiquarians, encountered ultimately implausible patterns of migration and cultural transmission, which assumed a single origin to human societies. The collecting of material culture produced such historical understandings, as profoundly imperfect as they were. The Society of Antiquaries hosted papers on several comparative studies on hatchets, which became the key object connecting ancient British and Indigenous cultures, with Bishop Littleton, Charles Harford, and notorious scholar of phallic worship Richard Payne Knight, all writing on comparative approaches to British and non-European hatchets. And yet, at the same time, curiously, as I've discussed elsewhere, British-made tomahawks were manufactured in England, traded in vast numbers with indigenous nations, then collected and brought back to Britain as examples of Indian savagery, such as this pipe tomahawk, made in the north of England for the Indian trade and collected as an Indian curiosity within a few decades or less. So while antiquaries desired to produce reality and access the past through objects, competing realities could also be masked or produced by objects. And while creating typologies of hatchets or arrows was useful for displays in museums or book plates and in giving papers to fellow antiquaries, Susan Pierce notes that without text, quote, typology all too easily becomes a species of board game. But besides the light which stone implements could shed on the universality of early human states and the perhaps imperfect knowledge their juxtaposition could produce, how else did antiquarians interpret the material culture of Indians, and where was it encountered? The reason I came across Lee's book is that it was owned by Horace Walpole, among his myriad of other antiquarian texts. And I was looking to answer two simple but related questions, which are, what did Horace Walpole think about Native people? And what objects from Indigenous people of the Americas did he possess in his eccentric archive at Strawberry Hill? I'm afraid that the answer in both cases has proven to be somewhat disappointing. And Walpole, unlike Lee, displayed very little interest in what he viewed as primitive societies and objects. As he once wrote in a letter, he has no curiosity in Noah and the Saxons, his progenitors, and, quote, Bishop Littleton used to plague me to death with barrows and tumuli and Roman camps. But in good truth, I am content with all arts which are perfected, and I care still less for the remains of art that retains no vestige of art. Despite his reputation for reviving the Gothic, Walpole in fact cared very little for the Middle Ages, once declaring, "I am too, though a Goth, so modern a Goth that I hate the black letter." He also hated the Saxons, though he did feel an affinity and affection for the Celts, and resented that, quote, "swarms of foreign monks were turned loose upon us with their new faith and mysteries to bewilder and confound the plain good sense of our ancestors. It was too much to have Danes, Saxons, and Picts to fight at once." While he is silent about the swarms of Europeans similarly invading North America, it is worth noting that in one of his bound volumes of historical tracts, a dissertation on the Coritani, giving an account of the colonization of a pre-Roman British tribe, is bound next to and followed by an expedition against the Iowa Indians, which describes Pontiac Rebellion. Perhaps here Walpole has left us a clue through textual curation. Yet in a 1781 letter to the Countess of Ossory, and I have discussed this in various times in the past, but Walpole speculates at length on the significance of quipos, or quipu, an Incan form of writing or inscription through knots on strings. Even still, the full significance of quipu is unknown, though recent breakthroughs have revealed them to contain detailed census information in some cases, but also precious local histories and knowledge, and perhaps even narrative. The Countess, a fellow collector, had loaned Walpole some strings to study, and he admits on returning them that he's not been able to decipher their meaning. Nonetheless, he writes, "I am so pleased with the idea of knotting verses, which is vastly preferable to anagrams and acrostics, that if I were to begin life again, I would use a shuttle instead of a pen and write verses by the yard." Walpole sees in quipu perhaps an art perfected, or at least an alternative form of writing whose materiality suggestively introduces different sensory and epistemological experience. Antiquaries became fascinated with the origin of writing as a way of tracing cultural history, and indigenous technologies such as quipu and wampum challenged the famous trajectory of writing laid out by William Warburton in the Divine Legation of Moses, as moving from hieroglyphics to alphabet script, which Warburton, of course, depicts as the pinnacle of written culture. In his own personal collection of objects, Walpole possessed several items made by indigenous North American people, including an Indian pouch made of beads and hair, a girdle, ditto, a collar, ditto, and 2 leather shoes, ornamented, ditto. These items, as far as I can tell, are lost, and it's hard to speculate on what Walpole thought of them. We can assume, since he did in fact keep them in his home, that he at least found them aesthetically pleasing. But he also owned Tudor necromancer and polymath John Dee's obsidian scrying mirror, described as the black stone into which Dr. Dee used to call his spirits. It's uncertain whether Walpole knew this, and if he did, it no doubt was less important to him than its singular use by a sorcerer to speak to angels. But this mirror is in fact Aztec. It was brought from Mexico to Europe by Cortez and somehow obtained by John Dee, who himself is the man who invented the phrase the British Empire. It was used in Aztec ceremonies of divination and now sits in a case in the Enlightenment Gallery at the British Museum. Besides this object, Walpole would have run across objects at auctions, as at the sale of the Duchess of Portland's museum in 1786, which he attended. Among the artificial curiosities, there are a number of wampum belts listed and other Indian curiosities, as well as birch bark boxes embroidered with porcupines, quills dyed of various colors, one representing a landscape with birds, flowers, etc. While among the antiquities is listed, in a rather suggestive ordering, a celt from Cornwall. And I should say a celt is typically a stone prehistoric tool, spelled C-E-L-T, but pronounced celt. Most often it's a small ungrooved axe. So a celt from Cornwall, an Indian stone hatchet from Detroit, a druidical bead from Anglesey, beans and corn from Herculaneum. Curiously, while Indian hatchets illuminated material culture in the 17th and 18th centuries, and ancient British objects were called tomahawks by the likes of Charles Lee, American antiquarians and archaeologists beginning in the 19th century started calling early indigenous hatchets celts from the British antiquarian terminology. Antiquaries themselves took up the word in the 17th century as they incorrectly imagined an etymology with the ancient Celts. Its use in North America perhaps suggests a kind of narrative displacement or historical reordering alongside patterns of colonization and removal, perhaps alongside an owning of the past. Even still, to this day, Celt is used by archaeologists to describe ancient hatchet-like tools found in burial mounds in North America, rather than using the indigenous words. In any case, the ordering in the Duchess of Portland's catalog of the Cornish Celt and the Detroit hatchet, followed by Druid and Roman items, presents a seemingly egalitarian approach to antiquity across cultures and geographies, while at the same time relegating the indigenous people around Detroit, who had launched a widespread rebellion against the British only 20 years earlier, to the ancient fragmented past. Walpole's understanding of Indians was not limited to these scant objects or the numerous books he owned on the subject, which it should be said he did in fact read very keenly during the 7 Years' War and often wrote about Indians. But Walpole actually encountered Native people in the flesh as a young teenager and carried the memory throughout his life. In 1734, a delegation of Yamacraws, who were a southern tribe in what is now Georgia, that emerged in the 18th century and was composed of disaffected Lower Creek and Yamasee people, led by their 90-year-old leader Tomochichi, visited Britain when Walpole was a teenager, if we can imagine Horace Walpole as a teenager. 55 years later, in 1789, Walpole wrote to Thomas Pennant, "I remember Queen Sanaki, as she was called, and who was brought over from Georgia by General Oglethorpe with her husband Tomochichi when I was a boy at Eton School, where I saw them, was said to have swum from Chelsea to Fulham. One of her eyes she had lost in battle. She wore a red paduasoy gown and petticoat, but no shift. Her hue was very black." And you can see her here in this portrait as well, wearing probably the gown that she wore, that Walpole saw her wearing at Eton. This vivid scene of Creek people at Eton College some 55 years earlier is tellingly punctuated by color and materiality. And certainly it's not surprising that Walpole's interest is mediated by aesthetic properties and by racialized difference. But the most important antiquary of the 18th century to consider in connecting British antiquarian and North American Indians, for my money, is Thomas Pownall, a prodigious writer who wrote, among many other things, a treatise on the study of antiquities as the commentary to historical learning in 1782, and an antiquarian romance in 1795. Pownall was an enthusiastic correspondent of Walpole's, paying him regular visits and even writing a vindication of Walpole's father so that he could win favor with us, which I don't think he was successful. Walpole consistently describes Pownall in letters as pert, pedantic, and boring. And in his accounts of their meetings, Walpole generally concludes by berating Pownall for his eccentric ideas. He wrote to William Mason on the 14th of April, 1781, "Pownall has tired me to death with reading a dissertation on the ruins of a building in Ireland, which he maintained were the remains of a temple built by the Danes on the foundation of a much older edifice raised by some nation who lived so long ago that nobody knows who they are. I did not dare to add, I suppose they were the Ammonians." Indeed, the Society of Antiquaries refused to publish some works by Pownall due to their long-windedness, which caused him to quit the society in a rage. Caroline Robbins notes that contemporaries were annoyed by Pownall's vanity and his conscious rectitude, and a repellent style and chaotic presentation of his admittedly extensive information and sagacious reflections rendered his books unreadable to any but the most determined. One contemporary satirist noted that Pownall's prose style seemed calculated to produce a most excruciating headache. Rosemary Sweet more sympathetically suggests that while Pownall's contribution to antiquarianism has not fared well historically, his work is interesting for his willingness to embrace the uncertainties of historical and antiquarian investigation. In any case, Walpole's copy of Pownall's treatise is in the possession of the Lewis Walpole Library and contains numerous handwritten notes. The treatise attempts to fuse elements of the austere empiricism associated with certain antiquaries with the more eccentric and perhaps fanciful claims made by the likes of William Stukeley, who connected the Egyptians, Druids, and Jews through mystical symbols and numbers to find a universal religion. Pownall similarly looks for broader trends across cultures and attempts, quote, to restore and re-edify history from the ruins amidst which it lies. Most of the written comments from Walpole in Pownall's text are harshly critical of the work and display skepticism towards the value of stadial theory and of understanding supposedly primitive societies. Pownall claims, for example, that in its earliest civilizational phases, the language of all humanity is one of metaphor and allegory. Walpole scrawls, as near as I can decipher, as Walpole's note, "Is it worthwhile to understand the pictures of a rude people? Are not the elements of such knowledge so simple that one may grasp the general without taking the trouble to understand them?" It's hard to know if this harsh and dismissive language is directed at Pownall or at rude people in general, so I'm inclined to assume it's both. But Pownall, known by Walpole and by the Society of Antiquaries as Governor Pownall, served as the governor of Massachusetts for 3 years, from 1757 to 1759, and briefly as governor of South Carolina following that, and had frequent dealings with Sir William Johnson, who was adopted by and famously married into the Mohawks. Pownall also dealt with various indigenous nations themselves. He describes, for example, the Great Belt of Wampum given by the British commissioners to the Five Nations in 1754. He writes, "It was near a fathom long and about a hand's breadth. At one end were the figures of 11 men hand in hand. On the other, 5 men also hand in hand. These two groups were connected by a line representing a belt of treaty." Pownall, quite astonishingly, claims to have designed this wampum belt himself, and notes, "The Indians were much pleased with this attention to their manners." He boasted 30 years later, "This belt, I dare say, is kept at this very day sacred in the council house at Onondaga, as a record of that great treaty and renewal of alliance." His direct experience in indigenous culture as both observer and participant obviously makes his insights important, and his engagement in treaties using the language of forest diplomacy while later diminishing such exchanges as the primitive articulations of an earlier civilizational phase resonates with Johann Fabian's critique of the denial of coevalness in anthropology. In An Antiquarian Romance from 1795, a work which puts forth the claim that romance could convey truth equally as well as history, and which Rosemary Sweet notes is an almost postmodern take on the past, Pownall compares the Indian to the Celt of Gaul. But unlike the Celt, the Indian, quote, "never has yet, in any one instance, become a settler and land worker, but instead has worn away in a languid decline to annihilation." Pownall was committed to stadialist theory and thus saw in Indians the universal experience of primitive societies. He notes in his treatise, which I've already indicated was harshly critiqued by Walpole, that the very language of these unlettered people is conducted by metaphors and allegory. And thus, when American Indians would describe their nation, their country, time, and the seasons, the actions of any kind, journeys by land or by water, war and its operations and glory, peace and its blessings, planting or hunting, they draw or paint some characteristic objects. For example, Pownall suggests, they generally describe their journeys or excursions by a canoe, war they commonly express by the hatchet or the skull breaker, and the making of peace by the burying of the hatchet. Thus, the objects that earlier circulated into European prehistory became part of a potentially universal vocabulary. Pownall also explains that Indians, quote, how in general some strange mystic, undefined notion of the pervading spirit of fire, and a communication of, or communion in this spirit among parties contracting, is with them the most solemn sacrament of the highest form. Thus, the act of smoking one common pipe of tobacco among parties in a contract is one of their most sacred acts. Pownall goes on to describe these important pipes, which are not their common ones, but are called calumets, and are, quote, painted and ornamented always with feathers and generally with embroidery of porcupine quills. The calumet is kept as the most solemn record of that treaty, so made and concluded, and smoked upon any future use made of or any reference had to that treaty. Pownall does not mention that the word calumet is in fact a Norman French word meaning reed and was not in fact used by native people. In Mi'kmaq, for example, the word for pipe is tmagam. Yet his description is not inaccurate based on his experience among indigenous nations in the Northeast and his diplomatic encounters with them. Tobacco was sacred medicine to most indigenous nations in the Americas and continues to be. As Christopher Parsons notes, tobacco was a gift to human beings to facilitate their relationships with beings with powers upon which they depended. In Mi'kmaq legend, Glooskap, offended by European treachery upon their arrival in North America, decided to leave Mi'kma'ki to live elsewhere. He traveled across a vast body of water by riding a whale that he summoned, and then gave the whale a pipe of tobacco. The whale, whom Glooskap's grandfather, puffed on the pipe as Glooskap watched him disappear from his new land, smoke rising from his blowhole. And French explorer Nicolas Perrault observed Algonquin hunters in the late 17th century, after having killed a bear, quote, light their pipes and put the pipe in the bear's mouth. They push the smoke out by the nostrils of this animal. The hunters here attempt to share the power of the plant with the spirits that control the animal as thanks and appeasement. In diplomatic pipe ceremonies between human nations, the shared pipe like wampum was preserved and used to renew agreements. Pownall notes, the Indians are very attentive to preserve these pipes, but we, who call ourselves civilized, never think more of it. And it's generally given away as a curiosity to some person or other. Thus, indigenous material culture becomes stripped of its complexity, and its collection marks the erasure of its important signification. It retreats into either typology or curiosity. And I'm just about to wind up here. He then goes on to note, I had one of these calumets, which was thus lodged with my friend Sir William Johnson on a very solemn treaty with some of the Western Indians. It was given to me after his death. He would not have parted with it. Esteeming it a singular curiosity, perhaps unique in his country, in this country, I gave it to Mr. Horace Walpole, and I suppose it is in his cabinet at Strawberry Hill. In Walpole's copy of Pownall's book, there is a large X beside this point in Walpole's shaky hand. And in the 1774 description of the villa of Horace Walpole is listed an American calumet, a warrior's wreath, and a neck ornament, presents from Governor Pownall. Thus, this, quote, pervading spirit of fire, the conduit between people and the spirit world, becomes dish to the armory of a Gothic home in Twickenham. While Pownall's book attempts to present a systematic approach to disparate cultural fragments, and in this section on Indians, he argues that every act of communication is pledged by some token, his seeming unawareness of his own participation in this kind of metaphorical exchange indicates that antiquaries, while not all sober faces besprent with learned dust, as in Pope's Dunciad, could still miss patterns and implication in the face of the objects of history. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robbie. Thank you very much indeed. I know that people will want to register their thanks. It's one of the strange things about this format that it doesn't really allow you to do that in an easy kind of way. But maybe we could just take to the chat for a moment and just register our profound thanks for a talk that moved us through such fascinating objects and histories and ways of thinking and between media. Really exciting. And I know that there will be lots of questions. Let me just explain to people how the Q&A for this seminar works if you haven't been here before. So at the bottom of your screen, everybody, you'll see 4 small circles. The one on the right hand side is a little icon of a person with their hand raised, and if you have a question, then that's the one that you hit, and when you want to ask your question, either feel free to unmute yourself and put your camera on, or to type your question into the chat if that's easier for you. So when you're ready, if you have a question that you would like to ask, please feel free to raise your hand. Rhys Kaminsky-Jones, would you like to either unmute yourself or type your question? Either is good.
Hi, Robbie. Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Hi. Thanks. Really enjoyed that. That was a brilliant paper. I just wanted to ask, so you mentioned the 17th century text where sort of contemporary British sort of quote unquote Celtic people were referred to as sort of modern day native people. Did you find any more examples of that from the period that you're looking at, sort of the 18th century? Because the only example that I can think of is the idea that the Mandan, who were associated with the so-called Welsh Indians, had Welsh coracles, used boats that were similar to the Welsh coracles used in Wales. Is that something you feel that has basically died out by the 18th century, and that it's pushed, the comparison is pushed more into a historical area?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, based on what I've seen, like that particular quote, I only quite recently came across, and it was definitely written by a sort of an English nationalist to sort of diminish the Cornish, the Welsh, and the Irish in that particular quote. So, but yeah, the sort of Welsh as Indians trope, I didn't really come across it so much, but yeah, it seems to me that by the 18th century, although I mean it does sort of go to Scotland a bit more in looking at like sort of Highland Scots. That definitely is still sort of quite alive, but yeah, not so much with the Welsh that I've come across anyway. But I haven't looked for it really.
Okay, thanks very much. I wondered if the metaphorical language thing in panel was connected to the to Blair's interpretation of Ossian, or whether that was a sort of in which Ossianic poetry is metaphorical in that sense. But yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah,
Thanks for the answer.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Rhys. I don't know whether there are any other questions. I was wondering, Robbie, about attitudes towards land. I was struck by the fact that you said that one of the things that antiquaries failed to understand about Indigenous North American culture was the extent to which monuments are integral to the land in which they are situated, that there's that kind of continuum. And I was thinking about that in relation to what you were saying about the draining of Martin Mere, and the fact that lots of the objects that the same antiquaries were interested in Britain came out of changing approaches to and practices on the land. And I wondered whether, I mean, I don't know the extent to which antiquarians in Britain consciously thought about the processes that were bringing these objects to the surface. Did they think about the land in the context with which they were most familiar, and you know, does that I don't know, either illuminate or occlude or in some way help us to think about their failure to consider the land in a North American context?
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially like in the case of Martin Mere. Of course, the sort of the access to this primeval past is through development and through sort of, you know, aggressive capitalist sort of sowing of the land, you know. So yeah, I don't really know, because like yeah, I'm not really sure, because of course like the stuff that they're encountering in North America is not being dug up. It's just there, right? There's sort of these living antiquity. Although actually there were some digs that happened in South America in the 17th century, but yeah, no, that I kind of threw that in because it's something I'm trying to think a bit about more. Because of course, like a lot of the ancient monuments here were, you know, sort of mounds, so quite similar in connection. But yeah, no, it's thanks for.
I was thinking about that language of improvement, you know, that is so characteristic to 18th century ideas about, or late 18th century ideas about what to do with the land, and I was thinking about that in relation to what you were saying about the kind of language in which British antiquaries talked about North American culture, and I was it seemed to me that there were connections there to be made, and if writers didn't make those connections, then that's in itself interesting, perhaps.
Yeah, and well, it's interesting how for the antiquaries, like this sort of ruins were an indication of civilizational advance, and sort of that you moved on to something. Whereas in the absence of ruins, there's a sort of denial of your access to ancient history. I saw a talk recently with John Akumfra and Sadia Hartman, and they mentioned in the case of diaspora, like the diaspora leaves no ruins as well. So it's kind of an interesting way to think about how that site is privileged, the ruin site.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Søren Hammerschmidt.
Sorry, it's giving me trouble here. No, the camera is not working fast enough. Oh, now it is.
It takes a little while, and then it's slightly that pause is very disconcerting. So
it takes so long to click through all the different things. Robbie, I've got a follow-up question actually on that. Would you say then that there is a difference between ruins and the objects that make it into collections, maybe in respect to what Rebecca was talking about as well?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, one of the things that I'm trying to think about more is the way that like Spanish antiquarians encountered the Aztecs and the Incas, who of course did have ruins, very extensive ruins, and thinking about what that sort of difference is, and what that, like, how that's thought about differently. I mean, part of it, like I said, is that there's this sort of Northern European interest in the absence of ruins because they themselves have no access to interpret their own ruins. Ruins are just a ruin is a sort of a blank sign of forgetfulness. Nobody knows what it means. Stonehenge, nobody knows what it means. So it's that kind of so the objects kind of have to be interpreted differently in the absence of them. I guess that's sort of the sort of preliminarily what I'm sort of approaching the difference as. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Fabulous, thank you. Okay, we've got a question in the chat from Merv. So I couldn't quite catch your 1795 romances and how they can provide truth, and was wondering if you could speak a little to that. That does seem like an absolutely fascinating text. It's not one that I know, but it sounds incredible.
So I have to admit I haven't gotten my way through the whole text because, like, I mean, everything I said about Pownall is totally true. It's really, really hard to read. It's very kind of all over the place. He wrote so much, and like his preface is usually like 100 pages. It's just sort of, he's very wordy. But the Antiquarian romance, he sort of argues very ahead of his time in looking towards, I guess it's sort of similar to something that Walter Scott would make through his historical novels, but just arguing that we can kind of learn and access the past through reconstructing it through narrative form, through romance, whether it's fiction or poetry or whatever. We have access to the past through these things. So that, like I said, Rosemary Sweet describes it as this kind of postmodern take on the past. But again, I definitely have not, by measure, mastered that text. It's very dense.
It sounds extraordinary. Okay, question from Agnes in the chat. So thank you, Robbie, for this wonderful talk. Have you compared British cabinets to American antiquarian collections from the same period? So I'm thinking of the MHS, for instance. What does that stand for, Robbie? You can tell us, perhaps, or AAS. Both accepted
American
gifts and
Antiquaries.
Okay, thank you. But I was wondering if their collections had survived and if there was any research published on the subject.
I actually haven't. I haven't compared the actual collections of 18th century antiquaries, so I'm not really sure. It kind of, like, as far as I understand, in terms of indigenous objects that were collected, it didn't really take off until the 19th century, I thought, anyway, in terms of American collections. So I don't know, but that would definitely be, especially when you look at somebody like Pownall, who lived in the American colonies for quite a long time, and obviously amassed a collection of objects there. I guess there's accounts of William Johnson having objects, but he wasn't really an antiquarian. But yeah, that's definitely that's a really good question. I appreciate that. That's something I want to look more at for sure.
I was wondering how far knowledge of and understanding of these objects was widespread in those kinds of communities that are on the edge of the hardcore antiquarian communities. Does this kind of material that you're discussing crop up, for instance, in the Gentleman's Magazine, or in those kinds of publications that are definitely antiquarian in bent, but that also had a wider readership? Would people more widely in Britain have known about Native American material culture, material objects?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting how the sort of the best way to tell, because of course some of the objects are gone and references to them are often references to material reality can be fleeting, but it seems that if you look at sort of language, when people start to use phrases like scalping and tomahawk, everybody knew the word calumet and wampum. Everybody knew these words. So that seems to indicate at least an implicit understanding. The phrase "bury the hatchet" was introduced in the sort of late 17th century and was used casually. Walpole himself talks about like scalping as a kind of metaphor to talk about how critics treat him. So I mean, there's a sort of embedded understanding of indigenous material culture into all this. The specific objects, I mean, it's there were certainly like wampum could be encountered in the British Museum and in coffee houses for sure. I would say wampum is probably the most common object that people would know about, even though they didn't actually know what it meant, but they knew of its existence anyway.
Wonderful, thank you. Are there any more questions? I can see Sarah added a bit of a follow-up. I think it was a follow-up question to the one about the antiquarian romance, and okay, so we might follow up with that. But I can see a new question from Lauren. Would you like to either unmute yourself, Lauren, or you're very welcome to do that. It's a little bit fiddly, but it's quite nice to see people on screen and hear their voices.
Hi, sorry, can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I'm coming as a kind of interloper because I look at Indigenous objects and transcultural encounters in the early 17th century. And I was just wondering about female antiquarian interests, if you've kind of come across traces of that. I've been doing a bit of work on Virginia Farrar from the 1640s, and she's named Virginia because her father is basically obsessed with colonization and the Virginia Company, and she has she kind of cultivates her own letter writing networks with people in Virginia, with agents who send her back tobacco pipe samples and samples of coral and things like that. And I wondered if you see traces of female interest. I know you mentioned the Countess of Portsmouth's objects as well, and if they kind of engaged with these objects beyond collecting and we're kind of developing some of these ideas around the objects as well.
Yeah, thanks. I sort of have looked a little bit into that, but not so much. But the one is the Countess of Ossory that had the quipos that obviously that Walpole was writing about, and I know that she had a few sort of South American objects. I don't really know the extent of her kind of engagement with it, and of course, yeah, the Duchess of Portland's catalog as well. But no, I'm interested in that. I don't really know. I haven't come across so much of Indigenous engagement with, because I mean, part of it I've really noticed in my book as well, that like so much of the discourse around indigeneity in the first half of the 18th century is so kind of tied and embedded in kind of male history. That I just haven't seen it as much, but I would like to, sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm sorry for those people who had their hand up in the chat. I was looking at in the participants list. I was looking at the chat and I failed to spot you, so my apologies. I wonder, Charles Pryor, would you like to either unmute or put your question in the chat? It's nice to see people, so yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
How you doing? I just have a question that kind of picks up on what Lauren just asked, and that's about networks. Where did this knowledge go? You know, not only among antiquaries, but where did it end up? How did it travel, and how was it used?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess you could say sort of more broadly, the knowledge goes into sort of history itself, into the museum, into sort of these sort of broader historical narratives of the 19th century. A lot of it seems sort of founded upon this kind of ostensible cultural dialogue. Of course, it's not a dialogue, but this sort of engagement with the past as experienced in the present kind of goes forward into in that way. And I mean, I suppose in other ways too, like the aesthetics of the 19th century, romanticism and all that stuff. But yeah, I think it kind of becomes embodied into Western cultural knowledge and arrogance, I think, in a lot of ways.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Jones, would you like to unmute?
Thanks. Have you got me? Great. I was just, thank you very much for the talk. I was just wondering if I could ask about Thomas Jefferson and the sort of survival of attitudes that I thought might kind of correct each other in some ways, but the survival of attitudes side by side in his thinking about and interactions with Native American communities. On the one side, presenting traditional ways of life as kind of an impediment to modernizing and modernity, and thinking of adherence to traditional ways of living as being, as he says, anti-philosophers. So there's something that's kind of retrograde about maintaining traditional ways of life. And then again, in some of his diplomatic addresses to native peoples, seems to show a kind of a much greater degree of nuanced understanding of and interest in artifacts and practices. So I mean, he says I've carefully attended to the figures represented on the skins and to their explanation, and shall always keep them hanging on the walls in remembrance of you and your nation. So what seems to be a much more nuanced understanding of the function of an artifact in a particular culture. And I guess I was just surprised by how those attitudes can cohabit and not correct one another.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, in fact, thanks for that question. And I mean, looking at Thomas Pownall himself, who obviously occupied both of those opinions, you know, was on the one hand an actual diplomat, and was on the other hand somebody who sort of dismissed indigenous diplomacy. Yeah, but I mean, obviously, yeah, there's a big transatlantic gulf there too. So, but yeah, I see kind of out of time. So.
Yeah, Robbie, do you have time for one last question from Carolyn Williams? Is that okay? Do you have to dash?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's fine.
That's wonderful. Carolyn, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, just have. Can you see me? Yeah. Can you see me?
We can hear you, and I think we'll be able to see you in just a second.
Okay, it's just that it was talking about, you know, women and collecting, and I was reminded of Aphra Behn bringing across from America those headdresses that were then used in performances of the Indian Queen by Dryden.
Yeah.
So there's an example of artifacts being displayed.
Absolutely, yeah, and of course they're illustrated in that famous drawing as well of the actress dressed as Indian Queen too. Yeah. Aphra Behn is a great example of definitely an early collector of indigenous material culture for sure. Thanks.
Oh.
Fantastic, Sarah Hammerschmidt. I can see you still have a hand up, but I think that may be a leftover hand up from earlier. But
No, I'm good.
That's great. Robbie, thank you so much. What a wonderful paper and wonderful ideas that we'll take away and reflect on. And I wonder whether everybody would just like to join me in giving a virtual round of applause through the chat to our wonderful speaker. Thank you all very, very much for coming and for your questions and for your participation. This is the last ODSECS.
Thanks, everyone.
This is the last ODSECS of 2020, and we've got a wonderful roster of speakers lined up for 2021. So please feel free to, you can subscribe to us via Eventbrite. All of our events go through Eventbrite, so you can get notification there. Follow us on Twitter, check the webpage, do all those kinds of things. But in the meantime, Robbie, thank you so much for a wonderful evening and a wonderful talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you, and thank you everybody.
Thanks.
And this is the awkward bit now when nobody quite knows at what point to go. So yeah. I give you all permission to go whenever you feel. And Robbie, I'll catch up with you another time and thank you properly.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Bye.
Bye.